Hi my friend, in this video we're going to be making a dark tech house song inspired by James Hype's song Vibrate. We're going to find out if we can do this in under 5 to 6 hours of in-studio time by using the 80-20 rule of tech house production. What you're listening to right now is the song that we'll be actually working on, and what you're looking at right now is the Ableton project file that we'll be working on. We're going to go through everything in the order that I actually built it out. So starting with the drums, then we're going to move on to the bass, then we're going to move on to the melodic elements like the vocals and the synths. And once we've built out the loop vertically, we're then going to build out the song horizontally by stretching it out using things like this arrangement track here up at the top so that we can guide our decisions using macro transitions, the larger transitions that happen throughout the song, as well as the micro transitions, little things that happen, little ear candy and little fills that keep things dynamic and interesting. Most importantly, we're going to be working with a reference track to quickly guide our decisions, as you can see right here. And we're going to be slashing hours of time and effortlessly mixing as you go by using powerful templates like this, as well as Ableton racks, one knob effects, and little tips and tricks that you're going to find out along the way. Make sure you stick around to the end because we will be doing a recap of the 80-20 rule so that you know exactly how to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the effort. All in all, this track did take me about 5 to 6 hours to completely mixed, mastered, arranged, and ready to go. And if you want to finish songs faster just like this, I've made you a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use to completely finish one song every single week. Visit the link that is on screen now or in the description to grab the ultimate song finishing toolkit for free. And if you want to take things to the absolute next level, you can find a link to this video's project files in the description as well. With that said, let's jump into this. All right. So usually when building up the drums, the first thing I like to work on is the kick. It's kind of one of the integral elements of like a dance music track. So it's important to get that right. And before diving into the kick, again, one of the biggest main things of the 80-20 rule with house drums here is to use a reference track. So I have the reference track here, the actual song, James Hype's Tita Lao, Vibrate, and I've set up so when I press the S key on my keyboard, it'll solo the reference track so I can flick back and forth between it like this. Just like that. So first, let's kind of just take a listen to the kick by itself. So you can see here now, the first thing is that usually one of the first things I'll look at is the pattern. So just flicking back and forth between the reference track and this, I could see that it's just kind of the classic 4-on-floor, like this. And then at the end of every 2 bars, there's a little bit of almost like a fill. So once the pattern is set up nicely, you can see here, it's just straight up like this. And the velocities I just maxed out, except for I dropped the velocity down a little bit on that little fill kick, so it's not too overpowering. Once I get the notes down, the next main thing is the sound selection. So the way that I went about this is there's a couple ways. One is I do have this rack with multiple different kick drum sounds in it, and I set it up so that there's this little selector so I can switch between them. The idea is you can switch back and forth between the track and yours and kind of listen to different kick drums until you find one that sounds as close as possible to the reference track. However, in this instance, what I did is I actually stole the kick drum from the track. So this is a cool little tip that you can do. What you do is either in the intro or the outro of the reference track, ideally get the extended mix so that it has that longer intro or outro. You want to find a part in the intro or outro where the kick is playing, and ideally there's no kind of like low pass or any kind of little arrangement trick going on. It's the kick playing in full. So in this instance, I believe I found it somewhere in the beginning of the track, around here. So you can see what I did is I just went into the reference track here and I sliced out a kick that I thought sounded nice. And then I dragged it into this Ableton Simpler device here. And so when you do it like this, what's nice is it'll actually drag the entire track into the Ableton Simpler. And that way you can easily adjust the start and end points. You can try out a different kick by just adjusting this here, which is a little bit nice. It gives you some flexibility as opposed to if you just kind of consolidated the kick and then dragged it in. So then what I have here is this little rack called the R kick. And basically all this is, for the most part, is I've macro saved some of the important important, how would you say this, knobs or settings in the Ableton Simpler device, so I don't have to like do some intensive menu diving. It's all just ready to go here. So one of the main things here is this filter frequency. So the filter in Ableton Simpler is mapped to here, and I brought it down to 403. So all the way up, it sounds like this. A bunch of noise and other sounds. So I brought it down to about 403, which I thought sounded good, or whatever around here. And the other thing is this filter envelope. So with this dialed all the way down, at 403 or even higher than that, it's like a typical how a normal filter would apply by removing a bunch of the highs, and it doesn't sound correct. It just sounds really weird, right? But if you dial in this filter envelope like that, usually all the way, it's just going to sound a little bit nicer and keep the integrity and the punchiness of the kick. And other than that, there's the volume to velocity. I usually dial this up. It's usually about, I think at 30% is where it starts. I usually like to bring it in so it just sounds a little bit fuller and more impactful. I have transpose set up in case I need to do some adjustments. And then I'll have Ableton, I think I'm using, Ableton Saturate, just bring in some saturation, fill out the sound a little bit. And then I do have some quick decay, sustain, release knobs here to dial in the tightness of the track, as well as the high shelf. As you can see here, just dialing that in, removing some of the high end, but not using a low pass filter. It just sounds a little bit more natural. And that's a look at that. And everything's just kind of set up to this device here so that everything is very quick and easy to access. If you would like to grab this, the Ableton project files will be available, the second link in the description. So you can grab this entire project file. You can snag any of the cool little nifty little Ableton racks and all these kind of little tricks that I've built out. Link for that is in the description. With that said, the first thing again is the notes. The second thing is the sound selection. And then the third thing, really, as you can see here, there's no other crazy processing going on. It's really just dialing in the volume. So the main thing is, if we go back here to the loop that we have going on, pressing the S key back and forth, trying to land it kind of on the kick so you can really hear your sound against the reference track. So let's go ahead and I'll kind of show you what that looks like. So once you have the sound selection, once you have the pattern, the main thing is really big tip here is to just get the volumes right. The volumes is going to get you really that kind of like fast track, that 80% of the way there super quickly. So once the kick is done, next thing I added in was this open hi-hat. So let's take a listen to that. And so now let's have a look at the pattern. So it's a typical open hi-hat pattern. It's just like kind of offbeat here. And what I've done is every other note just dips in velocity just a little bit. Just to kind of keep things dynamic and interesting and kind of humanized in a way. Again, after that, the main thing that I did was just kind of switch between this and the other sounds that I have in this rack to find the right sound. And the main thing again is flicking back and forth between this and the reference track, just like this. I think it's pretty close. Then going through the processing after that, I have this kind of channel strip that I have attached to almost every track that I add in, kind of like a default setting. So basically just removing a bunch of the lows, and then I high shelf up some of the highs just to add a little bit more. On the high end, it felt like it was lacking. And I have this one knob kind of transient designer. And so this is using the free KHS transient shaper. Again, I've just mapped some of the controls to the macros here, just so it's a lot easier and quicker. Also, a nice extra bonus is like, again, using your ears a little bit more, which is important. So what I just did was dialed up the attack a little bit and brought down the sustain, so it's just a little bit tighter. Main thing, trying to get the sound design right in terms of the sound of it, but also the tightness of the sound quite a bit as well. Then I have this one knob saturation and saturation. The sidechain, or one knob sidechain and saturation. The sidechain I'm not using in this instance, but I'm bringing up the saturation to fill up the sound a little bit. And then not using this width plugin. But this is usually the channel strip that I have on every single track. And again, this will be available if you want to grab the project files in the description. I think that's a good look at that. So we'll move on to the next sound, which is this kind of hi-hat pattern. So let's take a listen and we'll look at the MIDI for this. So I think the main thing you kind of hear is it's kind of that really quick 16th hi-hat. So let's listen between this and the reference track for a little bit. So it's really just kind of 16th notes with kind of like a little bit of like a swing and a groove to it. So what I did to start was, I believe I started with this track here. So it's just a different closed hi-hat sound. And I started with the kind of same pattern as the open hi-hat to start. And that way it reinforces the open hi-hat and also gives that kind of, it gives you the ability in the arrangement to remove the open hi-hat and you still have that hat there in place of it. So it's still kind of moving and grooving. And then you can add the open hi-hat later and it just adds more energy to the track. After that, I just kind of added in these kind of 16th note sounds here that I just highlighted and then played with the velocity so there's a little bit of a groove. And then once I had that dialed in, I just kind of switched some of the notes you can see here to kind of, the different notes kind of add a bit of like an accent and a bit of a groove, and that was really important. And then also what you might notice is it might look a little complex, but usually what I'll do is start by building out the first bar. And then once that first bar is created, I'll duplicate it and then just make some slight adjustments in some of the note placements or velocities or something like that. So there's a bit of a call and response, a little bit of change happening over time, which is really important to keep a track sounding dynamic and fresh. And again, main thing after that is to flick back and forth between the reference track to get the kind of right patterns and sounds. And then other than that, what we have, I'm running into this Sound Toys effect track using Pan Man on the, I believe it's the minor movement setting. So it's just kind of moving those hats a little bit of stereo movement left and right. Very subtle, but I find it interesting and cool thing to do. Then running into that channel strip I mentioned, removing a bunch of the lows, tightening it up by removing some of the sustain, adding some fullness by bringing in some saturation, and that's really it. Then the other main thing, again, the most important thing, almost none of that matters compared to flicking back and forth and trying to get the volumes right. So let's have a listen. So I would say comparatively, mine might be a little louder. You can come dial that back. Something like that. That's kind of the main idea there. Next element that I brought in when developing this was the snare. So let's have a listen and a look at that. And so for this, in terms of the pattern, main thing is what I have is two different snares playing. One is kind of playing like really hard, full velocity, and then the other one is doing some kind of variation so that it's layering the snare sound so it sounds kind of fuller and more interesting. And then also the change in dynamics kind of keeps things evolving, just like how we were doing it with the hi-hats. The main thing again though is flicking back and forth. So in terms of the pattern, it's definitely that like on the 2 and on the 4 kind of placement, and then the sound design. Kind of snappy. There also is, you might be noticing if you listen to it, a bit more high end, and in my ear that was kind of coming from a clap. So keep that in mind. We're gonna add that in the next layer. But with that said, in terms of any of the processing, anything cool going on, we're just removing some of the lows as usual with this channel strip, removing some of the sustain to tighten up the sound a bit, some saturation to fill things out, and that's about it. Next, let's listen to the clap, where together that's really kind of getting that sound. So let's have a listen. And flick back and forth in the reference. There we go. I would say if we listen to it, I feel like the clap could maybe come up a bit more. Again, the main importance really is that volume. So basically what I did was, in terms of the pattern, it's just on the 2 and 4, just like the snare, nothing too crazy going on there. And then I just flick between these different sounds. 2 ways you can do it is like just going like this, just grabbing them all and moving them. And then also if you do set things up where you have a selector, you can just go like this and it'll change the sounds as you're moving it about. With that said, other than that, a little bit of processing going on here. We're moving some of the lows, a little bit of the sustain getting pulled back to tighten up, a little bit of saturation to fill out the sound a little bit, and a little bit of this one knob plugin, which is this free wider plugin here. And I've just mapped some of the, again, main knobs to the Ableton rack just to make things easier, and then dialed in some of the whips to kind of move the sound to the left and right a bit. create more of a stereo sound. That way the snares are in the middle and the claps are on the sides, and together they kind of work together to kind of a nice full sound. So then just a couple more layers we're going to go over here. Next, once I have usually like these core elements, so like the kick, the open hi-hat, the hi-hats, the close hats rather, the snares and the claps. That's kind of like the main driving elements of the drum sound. Then what I usually like to do is layer in some tops, some breaks, things like that, to add a little bit more groove and kind of character to the sound. So let's have a look at the first top layer that I added in, which sounded like this. Listen to it by itself for a second. And so this is kind of reinforcing a little bit of that like kind of 16th note sound. It's kind of like a shaker kind of sound. Very subtle. The main thing is I do want my elements that I added in with the MIDI notes to kind of be the main driving sound, but this adds a little bit of vibe and character. So other than that, just some movement here in terms of removing a ton of the lows to make room for all the other elements in terms of frequencies, and then removing some of the sustain, cutting it up a little bit. Some sidechain here, which the way I usually do sidechain is just with a shaper mapped to the volume. That way it's just going in quarter notes, which is usually what the kick's doing in dance music. So that way you don't have to do any kind of compression, like sidechain routing. It's just done in one knob. You just dial it into taste, which I like to do. This way it's pumping, it's leaving room for the kick, and it's kind of giving a little bit of groove. And then some saturation to fill up the sound a little bit, and then width to make it stereo, push to the left and right a little bit like that. That's really it about that. Let's listen to this next top group that I added. You'll probably hear that a bit more. I'm gonna listen to it solo. So you can hear it's pretty subtle. The idea is I don't want like somebody else's loop or break or anything like that to be the main drum sound. It's just adding some vibe and character. So I believe I'm going to do, okay, one thing that I did do is I pulled back the transient. So if you have the warper on beats and you leave it on transients and then you change it to this right pointing area, you can bring back the transient. So normally it sounds like this. Where it would be here, sorry. That's how it sounds full, and then I brought it down to 50. Subtle, but sometimes it's less subtle, but in this case the idea is it tightens up that top loop a lot, and I find that's a really good way to make your top loops and breaks blend in a bit more with your core sounds that you've developed. Other than that, we have a little bit of processing going on here, so a little bit of wilder effects in terms of the EQ, but main thing is we're moving the lows to make some space for the kick and the bass, and then I've shelved out some of the highs to just kind of blend it in, mix it in with the rest of the drums a bit more. And then what did I do here? Okay, and then this is more of an automation thing. So I do have a low pass filter here set up, and right now it's not really doing anything. I just have it at a certain point in the song. I've dragged it back down for a little bit of an arrangement kind of trick, but in terms of the core sound, it doesn't have much to do with anything. Then we have a Sound Toys effects rack where I'm using the Pan Man, again using that minor movement preset to just kind of move things ever so slightly between the middle. Just add some stereo movement, some vibe, that kind of thing. And then some sidechain, so it's pumping and grooving, and it's making room for the kick and the bass, and then a little bit of width to move things to the left and right. That's really a look at the drums for this one. Alright. So, usually when working on the bass, the first thing I like to do is get the notes right and start with just a sub bass. So let's just turn everything off for now. Now what you're listening to is, I'm going to leave the drums on because I think it sounds more vibey and cool. But have a listen to the sub bass by itself. And you can see here, just kind of look at the MIDI. Pretty simple stuff going on here. Just kind of pedaling between this F sharp and this G. Just bouncing back and forth between the two with a pretty simple little pattern. For the most part, the velocities are hitting all about the same. So every once in a while, I did dip it near the end. Just a small little kind of ghost note fill kind of thing. Main thing here is when, as you can see in this project file, I have the James Hype song Vibrate in here. and set up so I can flick between the two by pressing the S key, by having the solo key on my keyboard, and just listening to that to kind of get a vibe for the pattern. So let's have a listen, flicking back between mine and the reference. The reference. The idea that I usually go for when I'm doing this is to get close to the reference kind of vibe and notes and pattern, but not too close that it's an exact carbon copy. The main thing I'm trying to do here is build something that sounds similar and then slowly take it to an original direction so that it can actually sound like an original track eventually. I'm not just trying to recreate tracks here. The idea is to be able to release songs. So that's kind of the idea there, starting off with a sub so that you can really focus on the notes and make sure you're hitting the right notes, and then flicking back between what you're working on and the reference so that you can kind of try to get a similar vibe. So next is having a look at the processing for this sub track. So what I have here is this thing that I've created, a V-sub2. Really all it is Ableton operator, I think with just an EQ8 here. So the idea is just a very basic sine wave sub sound, and then a couple different options for adding in saturation. So I'm using the drive inside of the shaper of operator for the most part here. The main idea here is with adding some saturation to the sub is to make it sound a bit more groovy and characteristic, kind of has a vibe to it, as well as to help it cut through like laptop speakers and shitty speakers and that kind of thing. And then scooping out a little bit of the low mids here. And then I do have attack and sustain set up with a transit shaper if I want to make those moves here, but I'm not doing that here. So it's an option to kind of tighten things up. And then I do have this one knob sidechain, which is kind of the sidechain that I have set up in my channel strip that I have set up for every single rack, or every single track that I add. And the way I'm doing this is a shaper, and then it's mapped to a quarter note, and it's just ducking the volume. So don't have to do any kind of annoying compressor, sidechain moves or anything like that. I find it a lot nicer and easier to just have it set up for one knob. Other than that, what I also have at the end here is an auto filter, and I'm bringing down a bunch of the highs. So you can see here, it's set out to one knob, so I'm bringing it down to 320 kilohertz, 320 hertz rather, and this is just kind of making it so it's mostly just the low end that this sub is taking care of. And then again, just having it all mapped to a Ableton rack here, so things are just easier. You can use your ears more than your eyes a bit, and all the main things that you want to use are really convenient, all there to go, and just makes things a lot easier so you can kind of mix as you go. So with that said, the other main thing is when you're flicking back between your track and the reference is to really focus on the volumes. The volumes is going to be really that fast track to making sure that things sound good. So first the patterns, second the sound selection, and then third is the volume. So let's just flick back and forth and you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. Just focusing on the sub. Which is really kind of that fullness you're kind of like listening for. Because then usually what I like to do is then I will then add in a mid bass layer, and that's going to add in more of that sound design and that character. So let me turn that on and let's have a listen to that. Flick back to the reference. Still similar. It's not the exact same, but I feel like it's kind of getting you there. And so, okay, a couple things here. One thing you might notice in terms of the pattern is there's no pattern. What I prefer to do is the sub track. Is what you can do is instead of it set to all ins, which it normally is, where it'll be listening for the MIDI on this track, if you instead change it to a different track, it's going to route in the MIDI into this track. And so what's cool about that is this way, as you're building out your track, if you decide you want to change any of the notes or anything like that, you don't have to copy and paste over all the MIDI for multiple tracks. It's just that you make the change on that sub track and it's automatically going to be reflected on the mid bass track. So that I really like. Other thing here is what I will always do on these kind of, as a continuation of this trick, is I'll have this pitch device set up here. So that way if the sound of your sub sounds really good at a particular octave, but that octave sounds weird or too high or too low for your mid bass, you can easily just use this MIDI pitch device to, in this case, I'm bringing it up 2 octaves. So an easy little hack there. In terms of the sound design, what I'm doing here is I just found like a cool bass loop. It's more of a synth sound. Usually I go for like a bass guitar sound in my sounds, but this one I really wanted to try something a little different and kind of find a cool synth sound. So what I did is I just found a bass loop that's had a cool bass sound to it, and then I just moved the end marker so it's just hitting the, like a single note from that loop, and then you'll see here in this on this like bass loop, the sound of it shows that it's in D minor. So then all you need to do is you need to change the root over here where my mouse is to D instead of the where it's usually C. This way, when you change it so that it's matching, the root note is matching whatever the root note of the sample or the loop is, it will make sure that the notes that you're playing are actually going to be correct, or else everything's going to be up a semitone or a couple tones or whatever it may be. That's important when doing this kind of technique of stealing a bass sound from a loop and then triggering your own notes for it. Super cool little technique there. Really would look into that, and also can get you some more mileage out of any sample packs that you might get. Other than that, I'm running it into a bit of an overdrive, just to add a little bit more character here, and a little bit of like, it's kind of exaggerating. It's really more of a sound design thing. It's kind of making it sound more gritty and underground and cool. And then after that, running it into an EQ8. Really important thing here is to remove a bunch of the low end, because you want the subs to be handling a lot of the low end, and the mid bass is really focused on handling the kind of character and the vibe, like I mentioned. I did boost up a little bit of the low mids here, just felt like it made it kind of punch out a little bit more. And then I'm using a combination of a high shelf filter to more naturally kind of remove some of the highs, and then I'm also using a classic low pass filter to get rid of a bit of the high end just completely there. Other than that, running it into this one knob transient shaper, where it's basically just this free kilohertz transient shaper, and the most common knobs that I use in that are mapped here, so I can kind of use my ears and mix as I go really quickly without having to open up plugins and anything like that. So I'm just ducking out some sustain to tighten up that mid bass sound a bit. Then I'm running that into this width plugin, which is another free plugin called Wider by Polyverse. Again, I've mapped the main knobs here so I can kind of use my ears more than my eyes and just really quickly make moves and mix as I go. The idea here is to push things to the left and right a little bit so that the sub is taking care of the middle area, and it's adding some stereo sound to the bass, which can be really nice sometimes. Then we're running into this sidechain. So just using one knob sidechain, similar to how I showed you in the sub bass, it's set up with a shaper and all that, so it's just, you can just quickly dial it in and use your ears instead of having to do any annoying, routing with the sidechain and all that kind of stuff. And then a bit of one knob saturation using Ableton Saturator. One knob, so it's just right there ready to go, and that's kind of adding some fullness and a little bit of grit and drive to the sound as well. And then I'm using a utility at a certain point in the sound, in the arrangement rather. I wanted to bring the volume down, and it's just a good idea to use the gain in the utility when doing kind of arrangement tricks in terms of automation throughout your track, as opposed to doing that on the actual channel, so that way you have a bit more control. The idea here is to have 2 separate tracks like this, so that one, the subs, is really useful for dialing in the notes, making sure that's correct, and then using that track to really focus on the low end, and that way you can have another track that's really focused on the sound design and the character. So let's have a listen back and forth between the two once again. And then ours. So definitely not a carbon copy, which is kind of ideal, but the vibe is definitely close to that. And then I'm wondering if you can kind of hear this. Super subtle. Just listen to that by itself. So it's super subtle, but I feel like it's adding a little bit of extra kind of character in the high end. Again, the same MIDI is getting routed into this. And then, so what I'm doing here is it's the same idea. So in this instance, the pitch is going up 3 octaves. It's doing the same sample here as before. But what I've done is I tightened it up a little bit with the ADSR, the attack, decay, sustain, release. So just kind of dialed back the decay and a bit of the sustain, so it's tightening up the sound a bit, removing a bunch of the lows, same kind of movements here. And then I have this cool like Berlin Ableton resonator, I believe, and it's just kind of making an interesting sound, I think. And then the width to push it up to the left and right using erosion, and then also having the LFO moving the erosion a little bit so that it's adding some movement and some character and some grit, and then tightening it up a bit further with the 1 knob sustain, pulling that back, 1 knob saturation to bump it up and make room for the kick, and then some saturation again to kind of fill up the sound a little bit. Should mention also that all of this is available to download if you want to grab the project files here. You can get this V-sub that I use all the time. You can also get access to this kind of like EQ into transient shaper, into width, into sidechain is kind of the channel strip that I have on all of my tracks. That kind of makes things easier, so I'm not always reaching for the EQ and adding it on, the transient shaper and adding it on. It makes it so that it's automatically there by default. You can make those mix-as-you-go moves that are super subtle, mostly focusing on your ears rather than your eyes, and then just moving through really, really quickly. And I do have a little bit of something going on here on the bass group, using this bass punch and parallel, very slightly dialing it in around 20%. This is kind of, what's it called, New York style compression, which is more aggressive compression but dialed in with the dry and wet. Can make things a bit sound more fuller and cool, basically, and then having everything run into the saturator, very, very light here at 20% as well. And then lastly, going to a K-clip, looking for about a decibel of reduction. All this is really kind of tightening everything up together, and that way, there's multiple layers, this kind of adds some cohesion to the sound a little bit, and a little bit of extra grit as well. Alright. So really my kind of take on the synths and vocals when it comes to kind of these James Hype tracks, or at least this Vibrate track in particular, is that really the main core element is going to make sure you have like really solid drums and a really solid bass line, because that's really going to be driving the track. And then likely the next thing is going to be like a cool vocal, and then everything else is kind of ear candy, window dressing, like little kind of fills almost with the other synth sounds. So I'm going to show you in the order how I built things out. So I felt like one of the main elements was to add in some vocals. So this is the vocal that I added in. And so I think it's from some kind of like lo-fi track that I kind of like. I can't remember the name of it. Maybe if I click into here, I can let you know. Corel Spinning is the track, and so I used a program called lol.ai to extract the vocal out so that I could drop it in here, and then just kind of cut it up a little bit, as you can see here, so that the vocals were landing on the spots that I wanted them to land on. It goes a little bit different, as you can see here, a little bit different where it was actually originally landing. So I just made some kind of cuts, chopped it up a bit so that it fit a little bit more with kind of this dance track. Then the other thing is kind of, that was the first bit, and then there's also this kind of like cut up part here. So let me just jump back and turn it back on and show you what that sounds like. You can hear it slowly swelling. It's almost like a transition. They solo it, it's pretty quiet. Getting louder. So almost kind of like a little arrangement effect kind of thing. So I think I probably heard that in the original track as well. And then so main thing was finding a cool vocal, which I just found from, I just have like a YouTube folder where I save tracks that I might want to extract the vocals from, that kind of thing. Found this, sounded cool. Boom. Wondering, let me just jump in here. I did have to change the pitch a little bit, so that's something you might have to do as well. So you'll notice that for the vocals, I had to drop it down a semitone to make sure that it's in key. And then I switched it to Complex Pro and adjusted the formants and envelope a little bit. Just kind of played around with it until it kind of sounded cool. No like necessarily rhyme or reason there. Main thing after that is, if we listen to the vocals, is flicking between the reference and the vocals to get the volumes right. So listen. There's that beat. I think ours maybe a little loud now, but that's kind of the idea. Really the main thing, just like other videos that I've mentioned, is to get the volumes right, pick the right sounds, and then get the volumes right. That's going to be kind of the main thing. So other than that, a quick look at the processing going on here. Again, main thing was that like the volumes. That's going to get that professional result comparing it to the reference track. Other than that, I'm running this into this cool little Alpine Vox thing. Shout out to my buddy John. He showed me this cool thing. So basically, you have an LFO on the pitch of the formant of this Nectar 3 plugin, and it kind of makes that kind of. If you notice that the vocal kind of sounds like it's warping slowly and changing, that's what's doing that. Kind of like the pitch is slowly dropping and going up and down. So that's basically what that's doing. It's kind of subtle, but cool. I think it makes vocal sound a little bit more interesting. Then I'm running into the channel strip that I usually run into. So what we got going on here is removing a bunch of the lows, making room for the kick and the bass, and shelving out a bunch of the highs. Just kind of mixing it in a bit. Too much highs, it can sound maybe too present, so removing some of the highs, it mixes into the tune a bit more. And using a shelf is a bit more natural, as opposed to a low pass can sound really harsh. Then it's running into, I'm not using the transient designer, it's running into a one knob sidechain. So I'll just turn up the vocals so that it's not interfering with my speaking. But running into one knob sidechain, so that's creating some pumping, and I have it set up in this one knob rack, so it's using a shape of the sidechain. It's going to a quarter note, which is generally like the kick drum, and then it's just ducking some volume. So this way, instead of having to map a compressor to the kick every single time, it's just one knob. You can use it by ear to taste instead of using your eye, and mostly just incredibly fast. And then it's running into some Ableton Saturator, just set up again to one knob, so I don't have to always open up Ableton Saturator and all that. It's just right there. I can focus on no visuals, just focus on the drive there, and not using any width. But this whole channel strip is usually what I have on every single audio track, so that I'm able to quickly mix as I go, make the common moves that I'm usually making, not doing any like surgical EQ or anything like that, just removing some lows, removing some highs, adjusting the transient shaping, some side chains and saturation, some width every single time. And so this, if you want to grab this will be in the, there'll be a link in the description to grab this project file, as well as every single week I'm recreating a new track in the Beatport Top 10 usually, so you can also grab that on a weekly basis as well. But with that said, let's move on to some of the next bits. So there's this kind of like little techno-y fill that we're going to listen to right here. And then it's going to come back in here in a moment as well. And so what that is we'll also listen to it over here. And so what that is I didn't even know what I looked up. I looked up something on Splice. There's clearly a lot of these cool little like techno-y, weird little stabby sounds. Like, doesn't happen all the time, but kind of like ear dressing or like ear candy that kind of happens throughout the track. So I just found a cool sample of it instead of like figuring out synths. I don't like using synths and sound design, traditional stuff like that. I like working with samples. So I found this cool thing. I cut it up and then I kind of chopped it up in different spots. In terms of any processing, just removing a bunch of the lows, high shelving out a ton of the highs, just kind of trying to mix it in a little bit. Then what I have is this erosion, which is adding this kind of like extra crispy, distorted, interesting texture to it. And then I've mapped an LFO to the frequency, so it's slowly moving over time. So that particular sound design trick here is kind of changing and evolving and more interesting, I would say. And other than that, running into that same one knob sidechain, so it's bouncing, grooving, making room for the kick, and then also a little saturation to fill up the sound. And then running into this one knob width plugin, which is a completely free plugin. This is what it looks like. I've just mapped like the common knobs to an Ableton rack, so that again, just a lot quicker. I'm not loading up plugins and opening up plugin windows. It's just the main things that I need to use are always there ready to go, so I can really quickly mix as you go. Let's look into one of the next elements that I added, which is this little guy here. And so the idea is there's a little bit of a call and response going from that first kind of synth sound to the second synth sound. So let's have a listen to that. Let's listen to it again. And so I think if we go back, let's also listen to the reference. That little dent is what I was kind of trying to copy. So, and then if you listen to ours, so it's different, and that's kind of the idea. So it's like trying to, I feel like the idea is when you're recreating tracks from the reference track, you want to kind of copy the vibe, copy the volumes, copy the note placements, but then start to adjust it and change it so that you can have your own original track. So there's a way that you can kind of thread the needle between copying and creating your own tune, and that's kind of what you want to kind of get to, in my opinion. So the next thing that I added was this kind of like weird texture element. So let's bring the song back a little bit, and let's bring up the volume on this. So it's pretty random and weird, but I wanted something kind of in the background. It's kind of like a dirty, ravey, warehousey, techno-y vibe. It's adding a little bit of something interesting going on, because again, did notice that in this track and in a lot of, I feel like in a lot of James Hype's tracks, it's really drums and bass dominant. So I felt like I wanted to have something adding some interest and texture, even if it's almost like binaural. It's happening like in the background and you almost can barely tell. Just something little extra there. So I just found something interesting in Splice, looked up textures, and then I ran it through an RC20 to kind of add some of that vinyl crackle and some like that warbling kind of lo-fi kind of sound to it, a little extra. And then what I have done here is used an EQ8 to roll off a bunch of the lows, so it's not like interfering with any of the other sounds. Where are we in the arrangement here? And I ran it into another RC20, adding a little bit of a different kind of vinyl crackle sound, and then a bit of sidechain so that sound is pumping, making room for the other elements, and a little bit of saturation to fill it out a bit, and then some width to push to the left and right, and add a little bit of stereo to it. Pretty subtle stuff on that one. So let's listen to the next element, which I added, which was this, which is actually freaking cool. So let me let me get to. I want to show you from this break into the drop. I'll show you this pad too. Turn up the volume. So first off is the kind of synth. So I just found some cool. What I found was just some cool chords on Splice and just chopped it up basically. And kind of paid attention to kind of a bit of call and response. So that it's kind of playing against those other kind of ear candy elements that were added in early. And so basically just chopped it up. And I don't think that's too much in the original track. I just added this in because I thought it sounded like really neat. And there's a bunch of like automation going on so that it's kind of like swelling and kind of has like a wah effect. So you can see the EQ. I've automated the low pass filter at certain points so it's kind of swelling in. And just cool stuff there. Basically removing a bunch of the lows. Other than that, I have a utility so that I think at certain points there's just like a pan little effect that happens. So the idea is to do it here in case I might want to make a change on the actual channel strip. And then you can hear that crystally sound. That is using the Soundtoys Crystallizer, which is one of my favorite effects. Just kind of adds this interesting texture to things. And then running that into an A1 trigger gate, which is free. It's really cool to get that stutter house sound. And I've automated the mix, so sometimes it's stuttering and sometimes it's not. And then a little bit of sidechain, so it's kind of pumping and making room for the kick. And then some saturation, so it's filling up the sound a little bit. And that's basically it. Then the other thing is this pad that we're listening to, which is just playing one note. And this is, I don't think this is in the original track at all. This is playing one note, so it's just like a drone, is what you would call that. And it's slowly like swelling in, adding in more of the high end frequency, I believe. And so to me, this just fills out. Oh, I moved it out of the freaking thing. Let me get that back in there. There we go. So to me, it just adds a lot of like body, especially to the break here, because a lot of this track is so minimal and like there's not a lot going on. So wanted to bring that in there, and it's just playing that one note, so it's just a drone, and then it's using this UVI Workstation Noctua binary system. Just picked a cool preset because I'm not too into like sound design, like I mentioned, and then just removing some of the lows and removing some of the highs, so it's kind of mixing it in. Again, throwing on that crystallizer that I like to use, which is just a different preset, so that it is adding that cool shimmery granular effect, which I love. Then going to sidechain, so it's kind of pumping it a little bit, and a little bit of width, so it's moving it to the left and right. And that would be a look at all of the different synths that I added into this track. Alright. So before I kind of like let this loop go and we rip through the track, there's a couple things that I want to point out. So one of the first things is, really big key here is to have a reference track. So we have a reference track in here, and this way you can kind of build your track up against this. And one of the big things is also building out this arrangement track. So you can see what I've used is dummy MIDI clips, just empty MIDI clips, while listening to this track, to map out the larger sections of the track. So where the sub comes in, the breaks, the drops, the intro, the outro, all that kind of stuff. And so these larger changes are something that I call macro transitions. So you can think of them almost like in traditional boring songs, like verse, chorus, like pop structure like that, but with the structure of like dance music. And so by doing this, you'll be able to quickly map out an arrangement that clearly works. It's done by a professional track, and then by also having it in the arrangement track here, it's a very quick visual that you can use to quickly reference as you're building out your track. So the idea is to build up the track vertically, the drums, the bass, the synths, all that kind of stuff, get a full multi-layered sounding kind of loop. And then once you have that built out vertically, you can use this arrangement track to very easily extend it out horizontally. The next thing is micro transitions. So those are things like that change. I should also say the macro transitions happen every like 32, sometimes 16 bars, but usually 32, 64 bars. Larger changes that happen over time that are a lot more obvious. Micro transitions happen usually, maybe sometimes 4 bars, but usually 8 or 16 bars. And it's small things like the kick being dropped out for a moment, or a little bit of a swell, or some kind of like ear candy laser happening, those kind of things that keep the track dynamic and moving and changing over time, because a lot of this music can be very repetitive. So the idea is to have these small changes happening, very subtle small changes happening, so that there is some movement. So with that said, I'm going to go through this, I'm going to let the loop run, and I'm going to speak through it, kind of give like a director's commentary, and try to explain as much as I can going through the arrangement as possible, so you can apply this to your own tracks. This project file will be available, so if you want to like dive into anything a little bit more particular, there will be a link, I believe it's the second link in the description, and you can get access to that. With that said, let's jump into this. So first is 16 bars of the intro, and so this is mostly just for the DJ to be able to mix into it. It's just drums. The first 16 bars, the kick has a bit of lows removed, and then after that, it's a lot more full. We've also introduced that hi-hat, and we have a slowly swelling vocal bit going on here. Not a lot of like synths or anything like that happening, but we all have these reverse crashes and reverse swells into a crash to signify the next spot, a little bit of a downlifter. And then at this point, the sub's kicked in. So you can now hear that the sub is playing, and we're slowly adding in a little bit of these little synth kind of stabs. Second half of this bit, so first 16 half, we had like that. The second half, we added in a little bit of a ride, which increases the energy. Bring up the volume on this. That's what that sounds like. Then we have a kind of reverse crash and a swell going into this break. And so at this point, we've removed some of the lows of the kick to drop down the energy, and we're swelling up the vocal a bunch, and then we're gonna have a little drop out right before. So we were slowly bringing in this snare roll, and then had a cool like little kick fill. Now we're in the first full drop, which is gonna go over the course of 32 bars, and we have a vocal coming in, which is the biggest change here. Second half, we've added in another ride, and added in some of that kind of ear candy little those weird kind of sounds. That's newer in the second half. We're going to have a swell going into this next break. It's a longer break because it was over the course of 32 bars. Find usually in arrangements, it's like you could see smaller break, largest break, kind of very common. So we've removed the kick completely this time. We're swelling down the vocals. We're going to swell them back up. We've also introduced this pad, which is filling out the sound in the break, which is important to do. And we have these kind of like swelly riser sounds coming in. And you can see dropped out a bunch of the elements right before. That's a nice little trick. And now we're into the second drop where this goes over the course of 64 bars. At this point, we've introduced this kind of synth thing that's happening a lot more, filling up the sound. And this kind of like stabby sound as well. The lasers happening every now and again. Weird little dropout that I just thought sounded freaking cool, so it just kind of cuts it up there. Now we're going into the second 60 bars, so quickly high past the kick for a second as a little transition. And now in the second half, the vocals are in fully. Then this next 16 bars add some synths. And the ride. So the first half there was one ride, now I have two rides playing. Slowly increasing the energy, keeping things changing. Now we're going into this big ass break. So at this point, just the kick playing by itself with the vocal. Bass is still playing. And we're introducing the pad as well. So after the first 16 bars, we're going to drop the kick out. Bass has been high passed, so we're reducing the energy. Vocals are kind of like doing that repeating sound, which is really cool as a transition. And the pads are slowly swelling more and more and more. Little drop sound. We have this 909 roll. It's going to add a lot to the build up here. Slowly adding more information with the synths. So you can see it's more sparse here, it's more dense here. Dropped out the bass there completely, so it's kind of bringing the energy down a little bit, but it's also bringing the energy up because the snare roll is happening. And then a sustained, like kind of one single note. Shoot! Bless me. You can hear just the energy's rising, the snare's building up. We have this sweep up thing, a reverse crash, a little pause right before. And then almost like a pre-drop. So the kick's in full, the bass is in, and a little bit of like weird noises, that kind of sounds. And then we're gonna go into the full drop after a little tiny break. And now we're in the last drop. So pretty much everything's playing here. Except for the vocal for the first 32 bars, or 16 bars. Let's have a look at this weird little dropout here. So let the kind of the synth swell in during that part. Just a cool little trick. Now we're in the second half. Just kind of high pass the kick a little bit as a little kind of like trick transition, and then now the vocals are in at this point, so the energy is increasing. We're adding in rides here. Next 16 bars, add an additional ride. Try to keep the energy increasing and changing over time. And then we're going to get into the build down. So we're going to start doing a kind of little trick with the vocal. And this is the part where DJs might start building in the next track. So you kind of want to start removing some of the information here and bringing the energy down in the track. So we're slowly going to be removing elements as opposed to what we're doing before. We're just slowly adding more elements, bring things in. So now all the rides are gone. The vocals are pretty much gone completely. Slowly swelling up as a little trick. It's basically just the drums and bass playing. And then we go into 16 bars of the outro, which is usually, it's very kind to just keep this as 16 bars of pretty much just drums, as little melodic information as possible generally, so that the DJ can mix in the next track really easily. So just slowly removing the information. So we got rid of a bunch of like the most main driving hi-hats, and then we're going to remove some of the claps. Just slowly dropping down the energy, with a little reverse crash going to the end. Hi, my friend, Matt from Best Friends Club here. And if you've been paying attention to this super long video, then you've probably figured out what the 80-20 rule is when it comes to building out your songs. The goal here is to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the time, energy, and effort. And because the first key to the 80-20 rule here is to use a reference track, we're making sure that we're very easily hitting 80% of a high-quality, professionally made song. In particular, we use that reference track to make sure that we're picking the right notes, sounds, and volumes as we're building out our song. The second key of the 80-20 rule here is to mix as you go in an extremely streamlined way by only focusing on the volume of each track, as well as using a simple repeatable channel strip for each track that we're adding to our songs. The third and final key is to repurpose your old project files and have a suite of powerful templates, Ableton racks, and one-knob effects that you've personalized and curated over time. If you'd like to get a head start by downloading all the racks, templates, and all the files that you've seen me use in the Ableton project file for this video, or if you'd just like to take a closer look at any of the techniques or tracks you saw me work on in this video at your own pace, you can find a link to this video's project files on screen now and at the second link that's in the YouTube description. I'm recreating a different song from the Beatport top charts every single week and making the project files available to anyone who wants them. You'll also get access to a private Discord where you can ask me and the community questions, as well as share tracks for feedback. If you or your music are not quite ready for a shot in the arm like that, I've also made you a completely free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that have helped me figure out how to completely finish one new song each and every single week. And you can grab that free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit by visiting the first link that's in the YouTube description here. However, if you just feel like staying on YouTube for now, that's totally fine. Save that link for later and check out this playlist filled with videos just like the one you just watched, where I completely create songs inspired by tracks found in the Beatport top charts. Or if you really want to take what you've learned in this video to the next level, make sure you check out this video right here.